I stood in the rain, my suitcase soaked, mascara running down my cheeks as my in-laws slammed the door in my face. They said I was unworthy of their family, but just when I thought I'd lost everything, the sky thundered and my billionaire father's private jet landed behind me. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button if you believe no one deserves to be humiliated for their background. Subscribe for more stories where life turns tables on cruelty, and watch till the end because karma lands louder than any jet. When I first stepped into the Bennett mansion, I thought I had walked into a dream. Everything sparkled, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and walls that seemed to whisper stories of wealth I could never imagine. I remember clutching my small purse tightly, afraid even to breathe too loudly, as if my presence might somehow disturb their perfection. I had married into a world where gold wasn't just worn, it was breathed, lived, and flaunted. And me? I was just a girl from a modest neighborhood who'd fallen in love with someone I thought saw me beyond all of this. Ethan had always made me feel safe. When he proposed, he said, "My family will love you once they know you." I wanted to believe him. Love, I thought, could bridge anything: status, money, class. I wore my mother's simple pearl earrings on my wedding day, believing they carried all the luck I would ever need. But from the moment I said, "I do," I felt the weight of invisible eyes measuring, comparing, judging. His mother was the first to speak after the ceremony. Her smile was tight, almost painful, as she leaned in and said, "You look simple, dear." Ethan's always had a soft heart. It stung, but I smiled anyway. I told myself she didn't mean it that way. Maybe she was nervous too, but over time I realized her words were just the beginning of a silent war I didn't know I'd signed up for. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was cold. I tried to make it feel like home. Fresh flowers on the dining table, small thank you notes for the staff, laughter in the halls. But every effort I made was quietly erased, as if my kindness didn't belong there. The maids avoided eye contact with me, scared of upsetting the real queen of the house, my mother-in-law. Ethan's father, a stern man with graying hair, rarely spoke to me. And when he did, it was only to remind me to behave appropriately at family dinners. Those dinners were torture. The table stretched endlessly, covered in food that looked too expensive to eat. His family talked about stocks, golf clubs, art auctions, and political donors. I tried to follow along, to add something, anything, but the moment I opened my mouth, silence fell. All eyes turned toward me, and I could almost hear them wondering what someone like me could possibly contribute. When I'd finished speaking, his sister would smile politely, tilt her head, and say something that made everyone laugh, usually at my expense. Ethan would squeeze my hand under the table, silently telling me to let it go. So I did, again and again. But inside, something began to break. Every morning, I'd wake up earlier than everyone, just to sit in the garden where no one looked at me like I didn't belong. I missed my old apartment, the sound of my mother's voice, the smell of coffee from the small cafe downstairs. In this mansion, silence was the loudest thing of all. Still, I held on. I told myself that love required patience, that maybe, if I proved myself, if I dressed better, spoke softer, smiled more, they would finally see me. I wanted them to see the woman Ethan saw when he chose me. But no matter how hard I tried, the walls of that mansion whispered the same cruel truth every day. I was the outsider, the unwanted guest, the poor bride who dared to dream too high. And yet, deep down, I refused to let go of hope. I believed love could change things. I believed they'd come around. I believed foolishly that being kind was enough. What I didn't know was that this was just the calm before the storm, the part where you think the world can't hurt you anymore, until it does. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and soon I began to realize that love wasn't always enough to survive in a house built on pride. At first, it was the small things, little remarks passed off as jokes, subtle looks across the table whenever I spoke. But as time went on, the cruelty grew bolder, more deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It began with my clothes. One morning, I came down wearing a soft peach dress I'd bought long before the wedding. My mother-in-law glanced at me from her chair and smiled faintly. "How quaint," she said, her voice dripping with something sharper than sweetness. "But dear, that color looks more provincial than polished." Her daughter giggled, sipping orange juice from a crystal glass, while Ethan sat silently, eyes glued to his phone. I told myself it didn't matter. That fashion didn't define me, but every word she spoke sank deeper into my skin. Soon, the conversations around me became weapons wrapped in silk. They'd talk about family backgrounds, pedigrees, and old money, all while making sure I knew exactly how far below their standards I stood. "Your father runs a shop, doesn't he?" his sister asked one evening, her tone innocent but her smirk unmistakable. "That's so humble. We haven't shopped for ourselves in years." The table erupted in laughter. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile. Ethan looked up briefly, then lowered his eyes again. He didn't say a word. I started to shrink into myself. Every room in that mansion felt smaller, heavier, colder. I learned to eat in silence, to nod politely when mocked, to laugh when they laughed. But when the lights went out at night, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, my heart aching with questions I couldn't ask. Was I truly not enough? Had love blinded me so much that I didn't see what I was walking into? The turning point came one afternoon when I overheard them talking in the sitting room. I was carrying a tray of tea, something I often did just to feel useful. My mother-in-law's voice drifted through the doorway. "She's nothing but a charity project." Ethan could have married anyone. Instead, he brings home a girl with no class, no name, no money. My chest tightened, and before I could step away, I heard Ethan's voice, soft, hesitant, but not in my defense. "Mother, please, let's not talk about it now." Not "she's my wife," not "you're wrong," just a quiet plea to avoid confrontation. That hurt more than anything she could have said. I stopped bringing tea after that. I stopped trying to join conversations. I became a shadow in my own home, floating from one room to another like a ghost. Present, but unseen. When guests came over, I was introduced as Ethan's wife, with a smile that barely hid embarrassment. Sometimes, when I walked into a room, their laughter would stop. I'd feel their eyes on me, judging, dissecting, waiting for me to slip. And I did slip. Once, at a dinner when my hand shook and spilled a few drops of wine on the tablecloth, the silence that followed was sharp as glass. "Careful, dear," my mother-in-law said. "This isn't the kind of table you're used to, is it?" The guests laughed, and I felt something inside me shatter quietly. From that night on, I learned to survive behind smiles. I played the part they expected, the polite, obedient, unremarkable wife. But deep inside, something was changing. The hurt was hardening, shaping into a quiet kind of strength I didn't yet recognize. I didn't know it then, but those nights of silent tears, those days of humiliation, they were forging something inside me. A fire, a strength that would one day make even the cruelest among them fall to their knees. But for now, I stayed still. I endured. Because sometimes, the most dangerous kind of strength is the one that waits. It happened on a night that was supposed to be a celebration. Ethan's parents were hosting one of their famous charity galas, an evening of glitter, champagne, and high society pretense. I spent hours preparing, carefully choosing a pale rose gown I'd saved for months to buy. It wasn't from a designer label, but it was elegant, graceful, and it made me feel beautiful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, as I looked at my reflection, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be different that night. When I walked downstairs, the ballroom shimmered under golden light. Laughter, music, and clinking glasses filled the air. People were dressed like royalty, and I tried to blend in, smiling politely, holding my clutch tight to hide my trembling hands. Ethan stood by the bar, surrounded by his colleagues. When he saw me, he gave a half smile, small, hesitant, and turned back to his conversation. My heart sank a little, but I kept walking, telling myself I could make it through one evening without breaking. The whispers started early. Women glanced at my dress and exchanged knowing looks. A man chuckled softly and said, "She's sweet," like a schoolteacher trying to fit in. I pretended not to hear. I smiled until my cheeks hurt, nodded until my neck ached. But inside, I was crumbling piece by piece. Then came the moment I'll never forget. As dinner was announced, everyone gathered near the stage. Ethan's mother, glowing in her diamond-studded gown, took the microphone to welcome the guests. Her words flowed smoothly, practiced and perfect, until she paused and turned toward me. "And of course," she said with a smile that could slice glass, "we must thank everyone who helped make tonight possible, our family, our dear friends, and all those who truly belong here." Laughter rippled through the room. I froze. The last words echoed like thunder in my ears. Those who truly belong here. My chest tightened. My throat burned. I felt every pair of eyes on me. She turned away casually, as if she hadn't just stripped me of every ounce of dignity I had left. I looked at Ethan. He stood beside her, silent, his jaw tight but his lips unmoving. No defense, no word, not even a glance. It was the confirmation I didn't know I was waiting for. I didn't belong. Not to them, and not to him. When I tried to leave quietly, she stopped me. Her voice was calm, cutting through the noise. "Elizabeth," she said, "if you're uncomfortable, perhaps it's best you take some time away from our home." "Maybe?" "Indefinitely," gasps filled the room. My legs went weak. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. Ethan looked at me then, his eyes empty, resigned, and that silence was louder than any insult. I walked out. No one stopped me. I grabbed my small suitcase, the one I'd packed weeks ago just in case my worst fears came true. The marble steps gleamed beneath the light rain outside as I stepped into the cold night air. I remember standing there, soaked, shaking, mascara running down my cheeks. The laughter from inside still echoed faintly, like ghosts mocking me from the warmth I no longer had. I didn't know where to go. Every part of me wanted to disappear, to vanish into the night and forget I'd ever belonged to them. I sank to my knees by the iron gates, clutching my suitcase, whispering to myself, "You're done, Elizabeth. It's over." And just as I whispered those words, thunder roared above me. I looked up, and through the gray clouds, a bright light split the sky. The ground shook, the air trembled, and for the first time that night, the sound of something powerful, something unstoppable, filled the silence. I didn't know it yet, but that sound wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of their reckoning. The rain poured harder, washing over me as if the sky itself wanted to erase the pain clinging to my heart. My suitcase lay half open on the pavement, clothes spilling out like the pieces of a life I'd failed to protect. I pressed my trembling hands against the cold iron gate, tears mixing with the rain. For the first time since I entered that mansion, I felt completely alone. Then, through the storm, I heard it. A distant hum, low at first, then growing louder, stronger. The sound didn't belong to thunder. It was something mechanical, powerful, and deliberate. I lifted my head and saw bright lights cutting through the clouds. Within seconds, the night sky split open with the roaring descent of a private jet. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that sound. I knew that insignia gleaming faintly under the lightning. My father's jet. I stumbled backward, heart racing. My father, Charles Hamilton, hadn't spoken to me in nearly 3 years. The day I chose Ethan, he told me quietly but firmly, "Elizabeth, love without respect isn't love, it's self-destruction." I didn't listen. I told him love was worth more than pride. I walked away from his empire, from his fortune, from his protection, and tonight I was living the consequence of that choice. The jet's door opened with a hiss, and through the mist and rain, a tall figure emerged. Even before I saw his face, I recognized his stride. Steady, commanding, the walk of a man who never bowed to anyone. Behind him, security guards rushed forward, umbrellas snapping open, shielding him from the storm. But he brushed them aside and walked straight toward me. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice steady, deep, and painfully familiar. "What have they done to you?" The words broke me. I hadn't heard my name spoken with that much love in years. I tried to answer, but all that came out was a sob. He removed his coat, an elegant gray wool coat, and wrapped it around my shoulders, ignoring the rain soaking through his own suit. "No one," he said quietly. "No one humiliates my daughter and walks away untouched." Before I could process his words, black cars rolled up behind the jet. His team of advisors, bodyguards, and drivers stepped out, forming a small army under the downpour. I felt a mix of fear and relief. The world that had rejected me was about to learn who I really was, the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country. As we drove toward the mansion, I sat in silence beside him. He didn't scold me. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply held my hand, the way he used to when I was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. Outside, the rain softened, and I saw the mansion lights glowing in the distance. The same house that had thrown me out was about to face the man I'd once defied for love. When we arrived, the guards opened the tall iron gates, as if the night itself obeyed his command. Ethan's parents stood frozen on the steps, disbelief painted across their faces. My mother-in-law's hand flew to her mouth. My father-in-law straightened his jacket, trying to hide his panic. Ethan appeared behind them, drenched in guilt, his eyes darting between me and the man beside me. My father didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than their entire empire. "You threw her out," he said finally, his voice calm but thunderous. "You mocked her. You made her cry in the rain." He paused, letting the words hang like judgment. "And yet everything you own, your business, your reputation, your comfort, stands on the investments my company made." Gasps filled the air. Ethan's father stuttered, We didn't know." "You didn't care to," my father interrupted. "But tonight, you'll learn what happens when you forget who holds your foundation." I stood there beside him, wrapped in his coat, trembling. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of justice that was about to unfold. For the first time in years, I wasn't the outsider, the poor bride, or the charity case. I was my father's daughter. And as I looked at those who had laughed at me, I realized something powerful. Sometimes the storm doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to reveal who's truly standing with you when the sky opens. The rain had stopped, but the tension in the air was heavier than any storm. The lights from the mansion poured across the driveway, cutting through the mist that still lingered like a ghost of the night's cruelty. My father stood tall, his presence alone commanding silence. The people who once laughed at me now whispered among themselves, their faces pale, their arrogance crumbling 1 second at a time. He looked around, his eyes sharp as steel. "This," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "is the family that threw my daughter into the rain?" His words weren't loud, but every syllable carried authority that needed no volume. The guards behind him stood perfectly still, while Ethan's family stood frozen, unsure whether to speak or disappear. Ethan took a hesitant step forward. "Sir, I didn't mean for..." "Didn't mean for what?" my father interrupted, eyes piercing through him. "Didn't mean for her to cry? To stand outside like a beggar while your family mocked her?" Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, like a man finally realizing the depth of the silence he had chosen. My father turned his gaze to my mother-in-law. "You must be proud," he said coolly. "You've raised your son well. To watch the woman he married be humiliated without lifting a finger." Her chin trembled. "Mr. Hamilton," she began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a misunderstanding. We've always cared for Elizabeth. Perhaps emotions were high tonight." "Stop." My father's voice cut through her lie like a blade. "I built an empire on truth and integrity. Don't insult me with excuses. I know how your family treats people who don't come with a price tag. Unfortunately for you, I also know how much your precious company depends on mine." Gasps rippled through the air. Ethan's father stepped forward, his voice cracking. "You're mistaken. Our partnership is solid, decades strong." My father pulled a folder from his assistant's hand and dropped it on the marble steps. "Not anymore," he said coldly. "As of this moment, every contract, every deal, every investment my company made in yours is terminated. I don't do business with people who forget what humanity means." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother-in-law's knees buckled, her carefully crafted poise crumbling as reality settled in. Ethan's father turned white as a ghost, his empire, his pride, disintegrating right in front of his eyes. Even Ethan, who had once stood tall beside me, now looked like a man watching everything he valued slip away in a single breath. Then my father turned to me. His tone softened, though his power still filled the air. "You have nothing to prove to them anymore, Elizabeth. You were born with worth they could never measure." He reached for my hand. "Come home." But before I could take his hand, my mother-in-law fell to her knees. "Please," she whispered, desperation leaking from her voice, "don't ruin us." We made a mistake. I made a mistake. For a moment I just stood there, looking down at the woman who once made me feel so small, the same woman who had laughed when I spilled a drink, who had whispered that I was lucky, her son took pity on me. I should have felt triumph, I should have felt satisfaction, but all I felt was clarity. "You didn't just ruin my marriage," I said softly. "You ruined the one thing I believed could make us family. And that can't be rebuilt with apologies." I turned away. Behind me I could hear the sobs, the pleading, the chaos unraveling. But I didn't look back. My father placed his arm gently around my shoulders as we walked toward the waiting car. The sound of my heels on the marble was steady, each step a reminder that I was done kneeling before anyone who thought my worth depended on their approval. As the car door closed, I took one last glance through the rain-streaked window. The same mansion that once made me feel invisible now looked small, like a fading memory. My father's voice broke the silence as the car began to move. "You see, Elizabeth," he said quietly, "the world never truly humiliates you unless you start believing you deserve it." And for the first time in years, I believed him. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of my father's private estate, a place I hadn't seen since the day I walked away from it. Everything was familiar yet foreign, like a memory trying to find its way back home. I stood there in silence, wearing one of my old robes, staring at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw someone who wasn't broken. I saw someone who had survived. My father entered the room quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You always liked it with honey instead of sugar," he said softly, placing it beside me. I smiled, a real smile this time. "I didn't think you'd remember." He chuckled. "Elizabeth, I never stopped remembering. I just waited for you to remember who you are." That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't anger in his tone. It was forgiveness, warmth, pride. And for the first time since that nightmare began, I felt peace. Later that afternoon, he called me into his study, a room filled with books, maps, and portraits of strong, relentless people who had built everything our name stood for. On the mahogany desk lay a stack of documents. "This," he said, gesturing toward them, "is your next chapter. The company's new foundation arm will be under your name. You'll decide where our money goes, who we help, what we stand for." I was speechless. "Father, I don't think—" He interrupted gently. "You've already proven you can endure more than most people ever could. You've shown grace under cruelty, compassion in the face of arrogance. That's the kind of strength empires need." Tears welled in my eyes. I had spent so long trying to prove my worth to people who were never capable of seeing it, and yet the only person I'd needed to prove it to was myself. Over the next few weeks, the headlines were everywhere. Hamilton Holdings withdraws from Bennett Enterprises. Social elite in scandal after family feud exposed. The world that had humiliated me was now forced to watch as everything they'd mocked me for became their downfall. But I didn't celebrate their destruction. I simply moved forward. I poured my time and energy into rebuilding myself and building something that mattered. I started a program for women who had been silenced, shamed, or belittled in relationships that stripped them of confidence. We helped them find work, stability, and self-worth again. I met survivors, dreamers, fighters, and in their stories, I found my healing. One evening, as I left the office, I saw a news report playing on the lobby screen. The Bennett family had filed for bankruptcy. Ethan stood outside their estate, head bowed, surrounded by reporters. My heart didn't ache anymore. I whispered a quiet prayer, not for revenge, but for redemption, because I knew what it felt like to lose yourself. I just hoped he'd someday find what I had finally found: peace. When I stepped outside, a gentle wind brushed past me. The sky was painted in gold, the same color as the jet that had once broken through the storm to rescue me. My father was waiting by the car, smiling proudly. "Ready to go?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "For once in my life, I am." As we drove down the coastal road, the sun dipped low, turning the water into liquid light. I leaned back, watching the horizon blur into endless possibility. And as the jet took off later that night, lifting me into a sky no longer heavy with sorrow, I realized something simple and beautiful. What they tried to destroy had only made me stronger. I wasn't the poor bride anymore. I wasn't their embarrassment or their burden. I was Elizabeth Hamilton, the daughter of a billionaire, yes, but more importantly, the woman who finally understood that dignity, once reclaimed, can make even the cruelest people kneel. Because when life throws you out in tears, sometimes it's only clearing the runway for your greatest takeoff.